The morning sun cast long shadows across the Riverside Community Center as Sarah Martinez finished setting up the last of the craft stations. 23 children, aged 6 to 12, would arrive any minute for the summer day camp she had been running for the past 5 years. The converted warehouse sat on the edge of town, surrounded by dense pine forests that stretched for miles in every direction. Sarah loved this job more than anything. At 34, she had found her calling working with kids who came from difficult backgrounds. Many of these children had parents working multiple jobs, and the day camp provided them with a safe space during the long summer months. The building might be old and a bit run down, but Sarah had worked hard to make it feel like home. "Miss Sarah! Miss Sarah!" called out Tommy Rodriguez as he burst through the front doors, his backpack bouncing against his small frame. At 8 years old, Tommy was one of her favorites, though she would never admit it. His infectious smile could brighten even the darkest days. "Good morning, Tommy," Sarah replied, ruffling his dark hair. "Ready for our nature walk today?" More children streamed in behind him. Lisa Chen clutched her art supplies tightly, while Marcus Williams bounced a worn basketball against the concrete floor. Soon, the large main room buzzed with excited chatter and laughter. Sarah's assistant counselor, Jake Peterson, arrived just as the last few children settled in. At 19, Jake was energetic and great with the kids, but he was still learning. Today would be his first time helping lead a group into the forest trails. "Everyone ready for our big adventure?" Sarah called out, clapping her hands to get attention. The children cheered in response. The plan was simple. They would take the well-marked trail that led to Lookout Point, about 2 miles into the forest. The kids would collect leaves and rocks for their afternoon art project, and they would eat lunch at the scenic overlook before heading back. Sarah had done this walk dozens of times before. They set out around 10 o'clock, with Sarah leading the group and Jake bringing up the rear. The children walked in pairs, chattering about everything from video games to their pets back home. The forest was beautiful this time of year, with wildflowers blooming along the path and birds singing overhead. About 40 minutes into their walk, Sarah noticed something that made her pause. The air smelled different. There was a sharp, acrid scent that seemed out of place among the usual earthy forest smells. She stopped and sniffed again, her heart beginning to race. "Miss Sarah, what's wrong?" asked Emma Foster, a quiet 10-year-old who noticed everything. "Probably nothing, sweetie," Sarah replied, but she was already reaching for her phone to check for any emergency alerts. No signal. She had expected this, as cell service was always spotty deep in the forest. They continued walking, but Sarah remained alert. The smell was getting stronger, and now she could see something that made her stomach drop. In the distance, above the treetops, a thin column of gray smoke was rising into the clear blue sky. "Jake!" she called back, trying to keep her voice calm so the children wouldn't panic. "Come up here for a minute." Jake jogged to the front of the group, and Sarah pointed toward the smoke. His face went pale as he understood what she was showing him. "Is that coming from the direction of the center?" he whispered. Sarah nodded grimly. The smoke appeared to be rising from exactly where they had started their hike. Her mind raced through the possibilities. Had someone left a stove on in the kitchen? Was there an electrical fire? Whatever it was, they needed to get these children to safety immediately. "Okay, everyone," Sarah announced in her most cheerful voice. "Change of plans. We're going to head back now and have our lunch at the center instead." Some of the children groaned in disappointment, but they obediently turned around and began walking back toward the trail entrance. Sarah pushed them to walk faster than usual, making it seem like a fun game rather than an emergency. As they got closer to the community center, the smell of smoke became overwhelming. Through the trees, Sarah could see orange flames licking at the building's roof. Her heart pounded as she realized how serious the situation had become. "Jake, take the children to the parking lot and keep them there," she instructed. "I need to call for help." But when they emerged from the forest, the scene was even worse than Sarah had imagined. The entire back half of the building was engulfed in flames, and thick black smoke poured from the windows. The heat was so intense that they could feel it from hundreds of yards away. Sarah pulled out her phone, grateful to finally have signal again, and dialed 911. The dispatcher told her that fire trucks were already on their way, but it would be at least 20 minutes before they arrived. The building was located too far from town for a quick response. "All the children are safe and accounted for," Sarah reported. "We're in the parking lot away from the building." As she hung up, Sarah looked around at the frightened faces surrounding her. Some of the younger children were crying, and even the older ones looked scared. Jake was doing his best to comfort them, but she could see that he was struggling to stay calm himself. "Miss Sarah," Tommy said, tugging on her shirt, "my mom's picture is in there." Sarah's heart broke. She knew that Tommy kept a small framed photo of his mother in his cubby. His mom worked 2 jobs and couldn't afford to replace family photos easily. Many of the children had personal items stored in the building. "I know, sweetheart," she said, kneeling down to his level, "but the most important thing is that everyone is safe." The fire spread quickly through the old wooden structure. Sarah watched helplessly as flames consumed the building where she had spent so many happy days with these children. All of their art projects, games, and supplies were being destroyed. But she reminded herself that things could be replaced. Lives could not. Jake pulled her aside, his voice shaking. "Sarah, how are we going to get the kids home? Most of their parents won't be able to pick them up for hours. They're all at work." Sarah felt a wave of panic wash over her. In her focus on getting everyone to safety, she hadn't thought about what would happen next. The community center had been more than just a day camp location. It was also the designated pickup point where parents expected to find their children at the end of each day. She looked at her group of 23 children, ranging in age from 6 to 12, and realized they had nowhere to go. The nearest building was the old gas station about 3 miles down the road, but it had been closed for years. The closest town was 15 miles away, much too far to walk with young children. "We'll figure something out," she told Jake, though she wasn't sure what that would be. As if the situation couldn't get worse, Sarah noticed that the wind was picking up. The flames from the building were starting to spread to the surrounding grass and trees. What had begun as a structure fire was threatening to become a forest fire. She gathered the children closer to the vehicles in the parking lot, as far from the burning building as possible. Some parents had cell phone numbers programmed into her phone, but many of the families didn't have reliable phone service or transportation to come get their children immediately. Lisa Chen was sobbing quietly, missing her mother. Marcus had gone completely silent, which worried Sarah more than if he had been crying. Emma kept asking logical questions about what would happen next, questions that Sarah didn't have answers to. "Miss Sarah," said 9-year-old David Kim, "are we going to be okay?" Sarah looked into his trusting brown eyes and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders. These children were counting on her to keep them safe and get them home. But as she watched the flames spread further into the forest and realized how isolated their location was, she began to understand just how dire their situation had become. The fire was growing larger and more dangerous by the minute. The parking lot wouldn't be safe for much longer. Sarah's van could hold 8 passengers, and Jake's truck could fit maybe 6 more with everyone squeezed in tight. But that still left nearly half the group without transportation. She tried calling several parents but got no answer from most of them. The few she did reach were frantically trying to leave work and find someone to watch their other children while they came to pick up their day camp kids. "Help is coming," Sarah announced to the group, though she was beginning to doubt her own words. The fire truck still hadn't arrived, and the flames were definitely spreading beyond the building now. Jake approached her again, his face grim. Sarah, we might need to consider walking toward town. I don't think we can stay here much longer. Sarah looked at the group of children and tried to imagine walking 15 miles on rural roads with kids ranging from 6 to 12 years old. Some of them were already tired and scared. There was no way they could make that journey safely, especially with a fire potentially spreading through the area. "Let me try the emergency services again," she said, but as she reached for her phone, a terrible realization hit her. The road leading to the community center ran in only one direction. It was a dead-end route that terminated at the building. To reach the main highway, they would have to drive past the fire, which was now spreading across both sides of the narrow road. They weren't just stranded. They were trapped. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat as she understood the full scope of their predicament. She was responsible for 23 children, ranging in age from 6 to 12, and their only escape route was potentially blocked by an expanding fire. The sound of sirens in the distance gave her a brief moment of hope, but as she listened more carefully, she realized the sound was fading rather than getting closer. The fire trucks must have been diverted to another location, or perhaps they couldn't get through the smoke and flames that were now covering the road. "Miss Sarah?" Tommy's small voice interrupted her panicked thoughts. "What are we going to do?" Sarah looked down at his trusting face and knew she had to find an answer. These children were depending on her, and she couldn't let them down. But as smoke began to drift across the parking lot, and the heat from the spreading fire grew more intense, she honestly didn't know how they were going to survive this disaster. The isolation that had once made the community center feel peaceful and private had now become their greatest enemy. They were too far from help, with too few vehicles, and potentially no way out. Sarah gathered the children into the tightest group possible, with their backs to the wind and smoke. She tried to project calm confidence while her mind raced through increasingly desperate options. Somehow, she had to find a way to get these kids to safety. But as the fire continued to spread and cut off their escape route, Sarah began to face the terrifying possibility that there might not be a way out at all. The wind shifted suddenly, sending a wall of thick smoke directly toward their huddled group in the parking lot. Sarah could hear several children coughing and crying as the acrid air burned their lungs and eyes. She had to make a decision quickly, even if it meant taking a terrible risk. "Jake!" she called out over the growing noise of the fire. "Get everyone into the vehicles right now. We can't stay here any longer." Jake nodded and began helping the smallest children climb into Sarah's van. They packed them in tighter than was safe or legal, but safety regulations seemed meaningless when facing a wall of flames. Sarah did a quick head count as she started the engine. 14 children were crammed into her van, including Tommy, who sat on Lisa's lap in the front seat. Jake's truck held 9 more kids, leaving them still short of space, but there wasn't time to figure out a better solution. The fire had jumped the road behind them, cutting off any retreat in that direction. Their only hope was to push forward, toward town, and pray that the road ahead was still passable. "Stay low and cover your faces," Sarah instructed as she put the van in drive. Through the windshield, she could see flames licking at the edges of the narrow road ahead. The path looked barely wide enough for the vehicles to pass through. Sarah pressed the accelerator and moved forward slowly, with Jake following close behind in his truck. The heat was intense even inside the vehicle, and she could hear the children whimpering with fear. The smoke was so thick that she could barely see 10 feet ahead. They made it about a quarter mile before Sarah's worst fears were realized. A massive pine tree, weakened by the fire, came crashing down directly across the road about 50 yards in front of them. The tree was easily 3 feet in diameter and blocked the entire width of the narrow road. Sarah slammed on the brakes and sat staring at the fallen tree in disbelief. Behind them, the fire continued to advance. Ahead of them, their path was completely blocked. To either side, the forest was too dense and steep for the vehicles to navigate. Jake appeared at her window, his face grim. "We can't move it," he said. "It's too big and we don't have any tools." Sarah's mind raced through their options. They could try to go back, but the fire behind them was spreading rapidly. They could abandon the vehicles and try to walk, but that would mean leaving the children exposed to smoke and flames with no protection. Or they could stay in the vehicles and hope that help would arrive before the fire reached them. None of the options seemed viable. Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her as she realized they might be trapped with no way out. "Miss Sarah," Tommy said quietly from beside her, "there's another road." Sarah turned to look at him, hoping she had heard correctly. "What did you say, sweetie?" "There's another road," Tommy repeated. "My dad showed me once when we came here for a picnic. It's an old logging road that goes around the back of the mountain." Sarah's heart leaped with hope, but she tried to stay calm. "Tommy, are you sure about this? Where is this road?" Tommy pointed back toward the community center. "You have to go past the building and up the hill behind it. My dad said it was built for trucks to take trees out of the forest, but nobody uses it anymore." Sarah felt her hopes deflate. Going back toward the building would mean driving directly into the worst of the fire. Even if Tommy was right about the logging road, they might not be able to reach it. "How far past the building?" she asked. "Not very far," Tommy said. "Maybe like where we park for soccer practice." Sarah knew the area Tommy was describing. It was about a quarter-mile past the community center, up a steep hill that was currently hidden by smoke and flames. She had never noticed a road there, but old logging roads were often overgrown and easy to miss. Jake appeared at her window again. "Sarah, we need to decide something fast. The fire is getting closer." Sarah explained what Tommy had told her about the logging road. Jake looked skeptical, and she couldn't blame him. It seemed impossible that they could drive through the fire zone and somehow find an unmarked road that might or might not still exist. "Even if there is a road back there," Jake said, "how do we know it goes anywhere? Old logging roads sometimes just dead end deep in the forest." Sarah looked at the terrified faces of the children packed into her van. Lisa was crying silently, her art supplies clutched tightly in her small hands. Marcus stared straight ahead with the blank expression he got when he was overwhelmed. Emma kept asking quietly if they were going to die, and Sarah didn't know how to answer her. "It's our only choice," Sarah finally said. "We can't go forward, and we can't stay here. At least if we try Tommy's road, we're doing something instead of just waiting." Jake nodded reluctantly. "Okay, but I think you should take your van first and scout ahead. If you find the road and it looks passable, come back for us. Don't risk all the kids at once." Sarah started to protest, but she knew Jake was right. It made sense to minimize the risk to the children. But the thought of leaving them, even temporarily, made her stomach churn with anxiety. "I'll be quick," she promised. "Keep the kids calm, and if the fire gets too close before I come back, try to find shelter in that drainage ditch beside the road." Sarah turned the van around carefully on the narrow road and began driving back toward the community center. The smoke was so thick now that she had to use her headlights in the middle of the day. The heat coming through the windows was almost unbearable. As they approached the burning building, Sarah could see that the fire had completely consumed the structure and was spreading rapidly through the surrounding forest. The flames were so intense that the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat waves. "Stay down and keep your faces covered," Sarah instructed the children as they drove past the inferno. She could hear some of them praying quietly in the back seat. The road past the community center was steep and winding, and Sarah had to drive slowly to avoid sliding off the narrow path. The smoke was even thicker here, and she could barely see the road surface. But after what felt like an eternity, she spotted something that made her heart race with excitement. There, partially hidden by overgrown bushes and small trees, was the entrance to what appeared to be an old dirt road. It was exactly where Tommy had said it would be. The opening was narrow and looked like it hadn't been used in years, but it was definitely a road of some kind. Sarah pulled over and got out of the van to investigate, leaving the engine running and the children inside. The heat hit her like a physical blow as soon as she stepped outside. The logging road was barely wide enough for a single vehicle, and tree branches hung low over the entrance. But it appeared to curve away from the fire zone and head up the mountain in a direction that might lead them to safety. She had no way to know where the road went or how long it was. It could dead end after a mile, or it could lead them even deeper into danger. But it was their only option, and she had to make a decision quickly. Sarah got back in the van and began backing down the hill toward where Jake was waiting with the other children. The return trip seemed to take forever, and she could see that the fire had spread even further across the road during the few minutes she had been gone. "Did you find it?" Jake asked as soon as she reached him. "Yes, but I don't know where it goes," Sarah replied honestly. "It's our only chance, though." Jake nodded and began transferring children from his truck into Sarah's van. They managed to fit everyone into the single vehicle, though it meant some of the older kids had to sit on the floor. It was dangerous and uncomfortable, but it was better than making 2 trips through the fire zone. "Hold on tight, everyone," Sarah said as she started back up the hill one more time. "This is going to be scary, but we're going to be okay." The children were remarkably brave as they drove through the wall of smoke and flames. Sarah could feel the van's temperature gauge climbing as the engine struggled with the heat, but they made it past the worst of the fire and reached the entrance to the logging road. Sarah turned onto the narrow dirt path and immediately realized how treacherous this journey was going to be. The road was rutted and overgrown, with branches scraping against both sides of the van. In some places, the path was so narrow that she had to fold in the side mirrors to fit through. They climbed steadily up the mountain, moving away from the fire, but heading into unknown territory. Sarah had no idea where they were going or how long the road was. Her gas tank was less than half full, and if they got stuck or lost in the forest, their situation would become even more desperate. After about 20 minutes of slow, careful driving, the road leveled out and began to wind along the ridge of the mountain. Through occasional breaks in the trees, Sarah could see the fire spreading across the valley below them. From this height, it looked like a red and orange sea covering everything they had left behind. "Miss Sarah," Emma asked from the back seat, "do you know where this road goes?" "I'm not sure yet, sweetie," Sarah replied honestly. "But we're getting further away from the fire, and that's good." They continued driving for another half hour, with the children becoming increasingly restless and worried. Some of the younger ones needed bathroom breaks, and several were getting carsick from the winding mountain road. Sarah's own anxiety was growing with each mile they traveled into the unknown wilderness. Just when she was beginning to think they had made a terrible mistake, Sarah spotted something ahead that made her nearly cry with relief. Through the trees, she could see a paved road running parallel to their dirt path about 100 yards below them. "I see a real road!" Tommy shouted, pointing through the window. Sarah found a place where the logging road widened enough to turn around, then followed a steep switchback that led down toward the paved road. As they got closer, she could see cars passing by occasionally, and she realized they had reached a major highway that she didn't recognize. When they finally reached the bottom of the mountain and merged onto the paved road, Sarah pulled over at the first safe opportunity and called 911 to report their location. The dispatcher was amazed to hear from them, as the entire area around the community center had been assumed lost to the fire. "We have emergency shelters set up in the town of Pine Ridge," the dispatcher told her. "It's about 15 miles south on Highway 18. Emergency personnel are standing by to help with the children." Sarah looked back at the 23 brave faces staring at her from the cramped van and felt overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. They had made it out of an impossible situation through a combination of Tommy's local knowledge, her own desperate determination, and what felt like a miracle. But even as she started driving toward Pine Ridge and safety, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about Jake. In her desperate focus on getting the children to safety, she had inadvertently left him behind at the blocked road with no vehicle and no way to communicate with the outside world. The guilt hit her like a physical blow as she realized what she had done. In her relief at finding the logging road and getting the children to safety, she had completely forgotten about Jake. He was still trapped in the fire zone, alone and without transportation. Sarah pulled over again and called 911 to report Jake's location and situation. The dispatcher assured her that search and rescue teams would be deployed immediately to find him. But Sarah knew that with the fire still spreading and communication difficult in the remote area, there were no guarantees that help would reach him in time. As she continued driving toward the shelter in Pine Ridge, Sarah felt the weight of her decisions settling on her shoulders. She had saved 23 children from almost certain death, but in doing so, she might have condemned Jake to face the fire alone. The logging road that had been their salvation was now their only connection to Jake, but Sarah knew she couldn't go back for him. Her responsibility to the children had to come first, even if it meant living with the terrible uncertainty of not knowing whether Jake would survive. As the lights of Pine Ridge appeared ahead of them, Sarah tried to focus on the positive. The children were safe, their parents would soon be reunited with them, and the nightmare was finally coming to an end. But she couldn't shake the feeling that their escape was incomplete as long as Jake remained missing in the burning wilderness behind them. The emergency shelter in Pine Ridge was set up in the high school gymnasium with Red Cross volunteers and emergency personnel helping displaced families from the fire zone. Sarah watched as each of her 23 children was reunited with frantically worried parents who had been waiting for news since the fire started. Tommy ran into his mother's arms, tears streaming down both their faces. Lisa's father held her so tightly that Sarah worried he might never let go. One by one, the families were complete again, but Sarah felt no relief. Every few minutes, she checked her phone for updates about Jake, but there was no news. "Miss Martinez?" A tall man in a fire department uniform approached her as she sat alone on a folding chair, watching the last few children with their parents. "I'm Chief Rodriguez. I understand you led these children to safety through the old logging road." Sarah nodded, though she felt like a fraud. "One of my kids knew about the road. I just drove." "That's not what I'm hearing," Chief Rodriguez said kindly. "The dispatcher said you navigated through an active fire zone to find an unmarked road that hadn't been used in decades. That took incredible courage and quick thinking." Sarah appreciated his words, but guilt continued to gnaw at her. "Chief, have you heard anything about Jake Peterson? He's my assistant counselor. I left him at the blocked road when I took the children to safety." The chief's expression grew serious. "We've been trying to reach that area all afternoon, but the fire has spread across most of the access roads. We've got helicopters doing aerial searches, but the smoke is making it difficult to see anything." Sarah felt her heart sink. She had been hoping that ground crews had already reached Jake and brought him to safety. The thought of him facing the fire alone was almost unbearable. "Chief, I need to go back for him," Sarah said, standing up abruptly. "Absolutely not," Chief Rodriguez replied firmly. "That area is still extremely dangerous. We have trained search and rescue teams working on it." "But I know exactly where he is," Sarah insisted, "and I know the logging road. I'm the only one who's actually driven it." The chief shook his head. "Miss Martinez, I understand your concern for your colleague, but you have no training for this kind of rescue operation. The fire behavior is unpredictable, and conditions can change in minutes." Sarah looked around the gymnasium at the children who were safe with their families, then back at Chief Rodriguez. She knew he was right about the dangers, but she also knew that she couldn't live with herself if she didn't try to save Jake. "What if I guided your rescue team?" she suggested. "I could show them exactly where Jake is and how to use the logging road." Chief Rodriguez considered this for a moment. "Our helicopter pilot has been trying to find that logging road for the past 2 hours with no success. The smoke and tree cover make it nearly invisible from the air. Sarah felt a spark of hope. I could show him where to look. I remember exactly where it starts and how it connects to the highway. After several minutes of discussion and multiple phone calls to his supervisors, Chief Rodriguez reluctantly agreed to let Sarah accompany a rescue team. However, he insisted that she would only guide them to the logging road entrance, then wait in safety while they continued to Jake's location. The rescue helicopter was waiting at a makeshift landing zone in the Pine Ridge football field. The pilot, Captain Martinez, no relation to Sarah despite the same last name, briefed her on the mission as they prepared to take off. "The wind has shifted, which is helping to push the fire away from the area where your friend is located," he explained. "But that also means we have a narrow window of opportunity. If the wind changes again, we could all be trapped." Sarah nodded and climbed into the helicopter with Captain Martinez and two rescue specialists, Rodriguez and Chen. As they lifted off from Pine Ridge, she could see the massive scope of the fire for the first time. What had started as a single building fire had grown into a wildfire covering thousands of acres. The flight back toward the community center took only 10 minutes, but it felt like hours to Sarah. Through the helicopter's windows, she could see the destruction below. The community center was now just a blackened foundation, and the forest around it looked like a moonscape of charred stumps and ash. "There!" Sarah called out, pointing toward the hillside behind where the community center had stood. "The logging road starts right at the base of that steep section." Captain Martinez maneuvered the helicopter lower, and Sarah could see the narrow entrance to the dirt road that had saved their lives hours earlier. From the air, it was barely visible even when you knew where to look. "I can see why our earlier flights missed it," Rodriguez said through his headset. "That's incredibly well hidden." They followed the winding path of the logging road from the air, and Sarah felt proud that she had managed to navigate it successfully with a van full of terrified children. The road was even more treacherous than she had realized, with drop-offs and narrow passages that could have been disastrous if she had made even a small mistake. "We're approaching the area where the main road is blocked," Captain Martinez announced. "I can see the fallen tree, and there's someone near the vehicles." Sarah's heart leaped as she spotted Jake standing beside his truck, waving frantically at the helicopter. He appeared to be uninjured, though his clothes were dirty and he looked exhausted. Captain Martinez set the helicopter down in the road about 100 yards from where Jake was waiting. The rescue specialists jumped out and ran toward him, while Sarah remained in the aircraft as instructed. Through the noise of the rotor blades, she could see Jake talking animatedly with the rescue team, pointing back toward the fire zone. But instead of bringing Jake directly to the helicopter, the rescue specialists began running back toward Sarah with urgent expressions on their faces. Rodriguez reached the aircraft first and climbed in quickly. "We have a problem," he announced breathlessly. "There are 4 hikers trapped about a mile into the forest. Jake heard them calling for help about an hour ago, but he couldn't reach them on foot because of the fire." Sarah felt her stomach drop. Just when she thought everyone was safe, they had discovered more people in danger. The hikers were apparently a family who had been on the forest trails when the fire started, and they had become lost trying to find their way out. "Can we reach them with the helicopter?" Sarah asked. Captain Martinez shook his head. "The trees are too dense where they're located. There's no place to land, and the smoke is too thick for a rope rescue." Chen, the second rescue specialist, arrived at the helicopter with Jake close behind. "The only way to reach them is on foot," he reported. "But the fire is moving in their direction. We've got maybe an hour before that area becomes completely inaccessible." Sarah looked at Jake's soot-covered face and saw the determination in his eyes. Despite being trapped alone for hours, facing a wall of fire, he was ready to risk his life again to save strangers. "I know where they are," Jake said. "I've been to that area before. There's an old hunter's cabin about a mile northeast of here. That's where the voices were coming from." Captain Martinez studied his maps and aerial photos. Even if we can get a team to them, how do we get them out? The main road will be blocked for hours, maybe days. Sarah felt a sudden surge of inspiration. The logging road. We came out through the logging road. It's the only route that's not blocked by fire. But we can't get the helicopter close enough to the cabin to evacuate them, Rodriguez pointed out. We don't need the helicopter, Sarah said, her plan crystallizing rapidly. Jake and I can lead them to the logging road on foot. It's not that far, and I know the way now. Captain Martinez looked skeptical. That's extremely dangerous, especially for civilians. The fire behavior is unpredictable, and the terrain is rough. But it's the only way, Jake added, supporting Sarah's idea. These people will die if we don't do something. The logging road is their only escape route, and we're the only ones who know how to find it. After several tense minutes of discussion, the rescue team agreed to attempt the plan. Rodriguez and Chen would approach the cabin from the east, using GPS coordinates that Jake provided. Meanwhile, Sarah and Jake would position themselves at the entrance to the logging road, ready to guide the hikers to safety once the rescue team reached them. This is against every protocol I know, Captain Martinez admitted. But sometimes you have to improvise. The helicopter dropped Sarah and Jake at the entrance to the logging road, then flew off to coordinate with ground teams and monitor the fire's movement. Sarah felt a mixture of fear and determination as she watched the aircraft disappear into the smoky sky. "Are you sure about this?" Jake asked as they began hiking toward the area where the trapped hikers were located. "No," Sarah admitted, "but I can't abandon people the way I abandoned you." Jake stopped walking and looked at her with surprise. "Sarah, you didn't abandon me. You saved 23 children. That was exactly what you should have done." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. "I left you behind to face the fire alone. I was so focused on getting the kids out that I didn't even think about getting you to safety first." "Listen to me," Jake said firmly. "You made the right choice. Those kids needed you more than I did. I'm an adult who chose to be here. They're children who depend on us for protection." They continued hiking toward the cabin, following faint trails and Jake's memory of the forest layout. The air was still thick with smoke, and they could hear the distant roar of the fire as it continued to consume the forest behind them. After about 20 minutes of difficult hiking, they heard voices calling for help. Rodriguez's voice came through Jake's borrowed radio. "We've reached the family, 4 people, including 2 children. They're frightened but uninjured." "Copy that," Sarah responded. "We're about 10 minutes from your location. Bring them toward the logging road entrance." When the rescue team and the trapped family emerged from the forest, Sarah could see why they had needed help. The family consisted of parents in their 40s and 2 teenagers, but they were clearly exhausted and disoriented from hours of trying to escape the smoke and flames. "Thank God you found us," the father said, tears streaming down his soot-stained face. "We've been lost for hours. We thought we were going to die." Sarah looked at the group of 8 people, the family of 4, the 2 rescue specialists, Jake, and herself, and realized they had another logistical challenge. The logging road was difficult enough to navigate in a vehicle, but hiking it with a group this large would be slow and dangerous. "How far is it to the main highway?" asked Chen. "About 5 miles along the logging road," Sarah replied. "But it's rough terrain, and some sections are very steep." Rodriguez checked his watch. "The fire is moving faster than expected. We need to get out of here within the next hour." Sarah felt the weight of leadership settling on her shoulders once again. These people were counting on her to guide them to safety, just as the children had earlier in the day. She was the only one who had actually traveled the full length of the logging road, making her their most valuable resource. "Okay, everyone listen carefully," Sarah announced. "This road is going to be difficult, but it's our only way out. We need to stay together, help each other, and keep moving no matter how tired we get." The group set off along the narrow dirt road, with Sarah leading the way and Jake bringing up the rear. The teenagers were struggling with the altitude and the smoky air, while their parents tried to encourage them to keep going. The rescue specialists helped where they could, but they were also carrying heavy equipment. As they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah could see the fire spreading across the valley below them, like a red tide. The sight was both terrifying and beautiful, a reminder of nature's awesome destructive power. About halfway through their journey, the younger of the two teenagers, a girl who appeared to be about 14, collapsed from exhaustion and smoke inhalation. Her parents were panicking, and the entire group ground to a halt. "She can't go any further," the mother cried. "She needs medical attention." Sarah knelt beside the girl and assessed her condition. She was conscious but breathing heavily, and her lips had a slight blue tinge that suggested she wasn't getting enough oxygen. "Rodriguez," Sarah called to the rescue specialist. "How far are we from the highway?" "About 2 miles," he replied after checking his GPS. 2 miles might as well have been 20 if the girl couldn't walk. Sarah looked around at the group and realized that once again, she was the only one who could solve this problem. "Jake, take everyone else and continue toward the highway," she instructed. "I'm going to carry her." "Sarah, you can't carry a teenager 2 miles through this terrain," Jake protested. "I'm not leaving her," Sarah replied firmly. "You guide everyone else to safety. I'll meet you at the highway." But the girl's father stepped forward. "I'll carry my daughter," he said determinedly. "Sir, with respect, you're exhausted," Sarah pointed out. "You've been hiking for hours, and the road ahead is the steepest part." What happened next restored Sarah's faith in human nature. Without being asked, the rescue specialists, Jake, the teenage boy, and even the mother organized themselves into a rotation system. They would take turns carrying or supporting the girl, ensuring that no one person had to bear the burden alone. The final 2 miles took nearly an hour, but eventually the group emerged from the forest onto the paved highway where emergency vehicles were waiting. Paramedics immediately began treating the teenage girl for smoke inhalation while her family cried with relief. As Sarah watched the family being loaded into ambulances, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them all to safety. What had started as a routine day camp activity had turned into a life-or-death adventure that tested everyone's courage and determination. Chief Rodriguez was waiting for her at the command post that had been set up along the highway. "Miss Martinez," he said, approaching her with a smile. "I hear you've had quite a day." "We all have," Sarah replied, looking back toward the forest where smoke still rose into the evening sky. "I want you to know that your actions today saved 7 lives," the chief continued. "The logging road you found was the only escape route available. Without your knowledge of that road, those hikers would have died." Sarah felt a warm glow of satisfaction, but she knew she hadn't acted alone. "It was a team effort, Chief. Jake knew where to find the trapped hikers, your rescue specialists knew how to reach them safely, and even the hiking family helped each other when things got difficult." As the sun set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the evacuation area, Sarah finally had a moment to process everything that had happened. She had started the day as a simple day camp counselor, planning nature walks and craft projects. She was ending it as someone who had guided 3 separate groups of people through a deadly forest fire to safety. The logging road that had seemed like such a desperate gamble hours earlier had proven to be exactly what Chief Rodriguez called it, the only escape route they had. Sarah had carried that route back to save Jake and the trapped hikers, just as she had used it earlier to save her children. As she watched Jake reuniting with his own worried family members, Sarah realized that sometimes being abandoned under fire isn't about being left behind. Sometimes it's about being the person who finds the way forward and comes back to show others the path to safety. The community center was gone, destroyed by the fire that had started this entire ordeal. but 27 people were alive because Sarah had refused to give up when escape seemed impossible. She had become the bridge between danger and safety, carrying hope back to those who needed it most. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: insurance paperwork, finding a new location for the day camp, helping the children process their traumatic experience. But tonight, Sarah simply stood on the mountain highway, breathing clean air and watching her rescued hikers receive medical care, knowing that she had done everything she could to bring everyone home safely. The fire would eventually be contained, the forest would slowly regrow, and life would return to normal. But the memory of this day, of finding courage she didn't know she possessed, and carrying an entire community's only hope for survival, would stay with Sarah forever.